So now that we went through all that trouble to prepare these images for vectorizing them, the time has come finally to start tracing them. So let's just select this first image here, the sketch that I did, and the one that we improved in Photoshop, and we increased the contrast on it. So once you have everything ready, the next step is tracing. And there is a reason why these buttons are in this order, by the way. Remember, we have the embed option, then edit original, and then tracing. That's exactly the order in which I went through as well these images. So image trace button would automatically start the process and use the default settings. But if you want to be a bit more specific, you can use this drop down menu, and then you can choose what type of illustration or image you are about to trace. I'm just going to stick to the default option, but I will show you all the settings that you can access once you use these other versions. So clicking on default will give us this. Now you might not be happy with this result. Personally, I am not happy with it. So what can we do? Well, first of all, what we can do is to change the presets. So instead of default, we can choose maybe line art. Unfortunately, that made it even worse. So what will work better then? Let's try maybe sketched art. That sounds similar to what we have here. That is actually getting a little bit closer, but still not good enough. So when you are trying to use presets normally in any other application as well, it's true, it's not going to work perfectly for everything. Every image is different, every scenario needs something different setting, and luckily in Illustrator we can access all the settings used for tracing images, and you can get to that by clicking on this icon called Image Trace Panel. So that will bring up this panel, and this is quite complex, especially once you click on Advanced, you get even more options, but don't get scared, it's actually quite simple how to improve the result of the tracing. So most importantly, what you want to focus on is the threshold. If you drag threshold to the left, after a while you will see the preview of the changes. It will use less detail from the original image, so it will be a bit more faded. Less lines will be vectorized. If you increase the threshold, then it's the opposite. Then more detail will be picked up and turned into vector paths. So the higher I increase the threshold, the more detail we start to see, until we get to the furthest to the right when the whole thing turns black. That's obviously too much. So even if I just go a bit below 255, which was the maximum value, it is already starting to look much better. But still, I think that is still too much, so I'm just going to reduce it a bit more. Now, unfortunately, if your line work is not even, then you won't be able to avoid losing some of the lines. Like on the head of this robot, I have that little cord connecting that ball to the head, and that is very thin. I forgot to go over it a couple of times because I want the other lines to be a bit clearer. That I will have to sacrifice. So that's just something you have to think about when you are drawing, and already plan ahead to allow Illustrator to recognize which lines are important and which lines were just for sketching. Now, can we improve it any more than this? Well, of course, we can play around with the other settings here, but to be honest, in these cases, they won't really make much difference. One thing I sometimes do is to reduce the paths, so that percentage, if it's less, then it's going to be a little bit cleaner. So just to show you, if I set it to 100%, it will be very jagged and noisy. But if I reduce it down, it becomes much clearer and neater. Another feature I really like is to be able to see before and after. By holding down that eye icon up here, you can temporarily see the original pixel image, the scanned image. And when I let go, I can see the result of the tracing. Holding that down, letting it go. That's the way you can see and compare what happened. And there's one other very important aspect of tracing images, and that is once you access the tracing options, the image gets into a special state where it's somewhere in between being a pixel and a vector illustration. So it's almost like a hybrid state, And while you are in this state, and while you keep your illustration in this state, you will be able to make changes to the settings. So it's good to keep it there, but the disadvantage is that you can't really make any further amends to it. So you won't be able to select like the head separately, you won't be able to colorize it properly. So for any further edits you want to do to the illustration that you would normally do in Illustrator, for that you will have to expand it. And there is a button for that up here, expand, which will convert the tracing object into parts. So it will make it accessible to make further changes. But before you do that, one last thing I would recommend to always check in the settings is the ignore white. Now, the reason why that is important is because otherwise, if you don't have that checked, Illustrator will actually turn all the white parts, the empty details, into vector objects. And to prove that to you, let me turn this off again. Notice that currently it will create 1411 anchor points, 146 paths. But once I turn on ignore white, it reduces almost to half. Because now it will only focus on the black details and it will completely ignore the white details. So that is actually very important, especially with the black and white scanned sketches. Now I can go up to expand and we can see the final vector artwork here. And of course it's not very difficult to add any details back that we lost. I can just use the pencil tool, for example, and I can very quickly draw back a detail like this. So if any detail that was important is lost, I can always recreate it manually. Once again, remember that your original drawing on paper should have the same density on all the important lines before you actually bring them into Photoshop and then into Illustrator. That can help to get even better results. But let's have a look at the next image. So I'm going to select that one, and I already have the image trace panel up here. I am going to start with the preset. I will choose silhouettes in this case, and straight away we get a very good result here. The only thing I would say is we are losing a bit at the moment is the nose, the detail around the nose, and also the umbrella is starting to be merged together with the head of this character. So how can we improve that? Well, for starters, we can reduce the threshold. That will already improve the result. We can go all the way down. Let's just see. Yes, after a while, you can see that little gap appearing there. But of course, if I go too far down, I will see all those lines showing up from the original texture. That's something that we try to already resolve in Photoshop with our adjustments, but we will have to still work at it here. I actually quite like some of them to show because it almost looks like the texture of the trousers. So a bit of it I don't mind showing, but too much of it obviously won't work. So something like that is a good balance. And that is what the threshold feature is like. It's like a balancing act. You always have to find whether it needs to go left or right, and it's really fine-tuning that until you get the best result. Also important to remember to keep the ignore white option on. That actually already came as an enabled feature with this silhouette preset. And I'm actually quite happy with this, so I can now click on expand. So if we compare the two illustrations in the layers panel, this one will have only one object because it's a big silhouette that's everything is all connected, so it's a compound shape. While if I open up the other group of the robot, there we will see several items because it has lines that are not connected. And the reason I'm showing this is because it always makes a difference how you handle a result which turns into one compound object or just even a simple shape, and another object that's made up of lots of separate individual parts. We'll see how to work with these in the next video, but let's move on to the other two images here. So let's start with the seagull. Let's see what happens if I just click on image trace again. When I do that, it will go ahead and do something very similar to what we've seen before. So it creates a black and white vector version of the original photo. Now, of course, if I go into the settings, I can change the preset, and maybe I want to use 3 colors. So in this case, because it's a photographs with colors, I might want to actually see those colors and turn them into vector artwork. I mentioned that when you have a very high resolution, a high PPI value on an image, that can cause problems, and this is exactly what I meant. It would take really long to render something if it's extremely high PPI. So if the resolution of that image is extremely high. So let me just go back one step. I'm just going to undo the tracing options and go back completely to before, so you can see how high my PPI value is. So it's definitely way above the necessary amount. Now, how can I reduce that? Once again, we will need to edit the original for that. So I'm going to click on Edit Original, and in Photoshop, you can go to Image, Image Size, where you can reduce the size. What I would recommend normally is to have the resample option on, and then maybe reduce the width to 2000. That is still very detailed. As you can see, this is showing the changed size. I might even change that down to 1000. That will be perfectly enough detail for what we are doing now. So you don't want to use extremely high resolution images. If you use them, you might be able to get more detail on your vector art, but only if you want it to be very detailed. And that is actually a contradiction, because if you want to see all those details, just keep on using the photograph. What tracing is all about is simplifying a photo into a vector artwork. So reducing the size actually helps that simplification process. So let me click OK. You can see how much smaller the image got already. Now we just have to save it. So I go to File, Save. And when I go back to Illustrator, I say yes here as well, so it updates. And immediately the resolution, the PPI value, is much better, 351. It's still above 300. So if I wanted to use this in print with its current state, it would work fine. But I'm not worried about that value anymore, because I will vectorize this anyway. And once you vectorize something, so once you trace an image, after that there's no point in talking about resolution, because vector art is resolution independent. So no more PPI to concern about. So let me choose that preset that we had before. Remember how long it took before to render this. Now if I choose 3 colors, see how much faster it will give us the result. So I'm not saying this is a good result, but we can definitely see the improvement in the speed of this whole tracing process. But probably 3 colors is too less. So let's just go up to 6 colors. So we are allowing Illustrator a bit more space to work with. If that's still not enough, I can go up even to 16 colors, let's say. And yes, that's where we start to see the differentiation between the feathers and the beak. That's much closer to what we would expect to see when we look at a seagull. So the palette is still set to limited. Now, what if I change that to automatic? Now, this obviously looks so much better. If you look at the beak, the eyes, there's so much more detail there. But it got better because we chose automatic color palette, which actually picked 623 colors. Obviously, if we use that much colors, it has to look better or more closer to the original photograph. By the way, a camera normally captures 16.7 million colors. That's a standard RGB 8-bit per channel color profile. But without getting too technical, after this point, it's really up to you what you want to achieve. So you can even change the mode back to grayscale if you don't actually need colors, you just want it to be grayscale. Decide how much gray values you allow Illustrator to use. So you can have a really good black and white version or grayscale version, or we can go back to the color mode. Once again, we get back to the result we've seen before. Now still with paths, you can also play around, and if you reduce it, you will get a little bit softer result, so less sharp edges there. if you increase it to the maximum value, you will have lots of little details sticking out, and this is again getting closer to the original photograph. So if you want to create a vector version of a photograph that looks very photorealistic, you can start with increasing colors and paths all the way to the maximum. But if you want to have an abstracted, simplified version, which looks more like a vector art, then I would recommend to reduce the paths down to almost the minimum value, and also probably try to reduce the amount of colors used, because the higher it is, the more photorealistic it will look like. So here, colors is really that seesaw that we had with threshold in the previous examples. Again, it's a balancing act, and it's up to you whether you prefer a bit more abstract version or you like the realistic version. When you move further down, you also have options like corners, which can again change the look and feel of these lines that Illustrator creates. So if I increase that up to 100%, it will look like this. If I reduce it down to 0%, it will look like that. Once again, 0% is a bit more simplified. If I reduce the noise also down to 1 pixel, that is actually doing something opposite. So this value, the lower it is, the more closer you get to the original photo, while if you drag it all the way to the right, it will get more abstracted. Having the noise set to 100 pixels, the maximum value, we actually lost all the differentiation between the feathers. But once again, as I said, this is all about playing around with these values and see what works best for the current image you are working with. I just really wanted to see the iris, so that's why I was messing around with the values. And in this case, I don't have to turn on ignore white. It won't really make much difference because we have a transparent background. So when you use a PSD file, which was already masked, then you don't have to worry about the ignore white option. So let's click on expand now that we've done this, and we can see our final version here. Now let's move down to the image with the girl, and I'm just going to quickly reapply the settings that we had there. I'm going to first of all choose color. It's going to be automatic, and the values can work the way they are set here. So I can just click on preview. And there you go. That is the vectorized version. It looks very realistic. But once we zoom closer, you will start to see all those areas, the vector objects that the tracing feature created. So this is again that decision that you have to make, whether you want to see a lot of detail or whether you want to get a little bit smoother result. So I can switch the palette from automatic to limited. That's a quick way to really get an abstracted version. So as you can see now, it's only using 30 colors, and that's what it's managed to create from it. So it's using like an average of the most common colors and distributes them in this limited color palette. But you can further reduce that if you want. Let's just say 10 colors. If I only allow that much, we will see how that looks. So she's getting more and more green, but don't forget that you can always change the colors later. So if you only have 10 colors, it will be much easier to play around with those colors and refine them. While if you use a lot of colors, then it will be always more complex to make amends to them. But just in case you prefer the photorealistic vector art, then I would recommend instead of automatic to use full tone. That's going to include the most amount of colors, and obviously that will take the longest time as well to render, but we will see how it looks once it goes through. There you go. This one actually used 8,000, almost 9,000 colors, and it had to create 11, almost 12,000 paths. But if I zoom closer, we will see much less sharp edges, and even the skin looks much smoother. Of course, after a while it still gets blocky, but as long as you look at it from a distance, it looks almost like a photograph. Even the little fine hair details we can see, and they are separate. I will click on expand and close the trace panel, and that is just a simple indication of how much work Illustrator did in the background. all these parts had to be generated and calculated from the original image to be able to turn this into a vector artwork. But looking at all the examples that we've worked through, you can see the range of features and options you have when you're tracing images and turning them into vector artwork. It really comes down to the source material, what you want to achieve, and how you use the tracing settings here in Illustrator. So now that we went through all these settings, in the next video we will have a look at how we actually can change the colors and work with these traced vector objects.